So what we're going to be doing today, we're calling it metabolic chaos, and it is the intersection of foundational science, real science, and metabolic disorders. And this is the article by Robert Naviaux, excellent researcher. And I have to tell you, if nothing else, if anybody really wants to get an idea of what's going on, read this article. It is absolutely wonderful with an incredible number of references. And what they are saying at the end of all of this is that you need to reframe the pathogenesis of chronic illness. And you need to reframe it as a systems problem that is maintaining disease. That disease continues because of something that's gone wrong. And so rather than focusing on whatever the remote triggers may have been that caused the initial injury, it allows us now to really focus on the various therapies, the signaling therapies that are going to unblock the healing cycle and is going to be able to restore health where other approaches may have failed. Now, what does all of that really mean? And as Reid has alluded to, when you're looking at chronic diseases that are driven by various types of metabolic dysfunction, it is really quite striking to know that chronic medical condition, and this is from the NIH, by the way, chronic medical conditions cause over 50% of world deaths. This is disastrous. Chronic medical conditions. In fact, greater than 50% of adults, and as you said, Reid, 30% of teens, more than that, in the US, live with at least one chronic illness. Again, this is from the CDC. So we are referencing all of this. So chronic disease, it is posited that it is the consequence of a blocked natural healing cycle. And we're going to go over this in a few minutes, but something has happened to the natural healing cycle that is disrupting it both in a metabolic and at the cellular level, which is not allowing healing to continue in its normal way. How is that happening? Well, cells are getting into a loop of incomplete recovery, they're re-injuring, they're unable to fully heal. And so we know that this seems to be the root of every chronic illness that is known, including, as I've noted here, the susceptibility to a whole number of recurrent infections and autoimmune diseases. And here, this list is incredible, from rheumatoid arthritis through to COPD, Alzheimer's, dementia, etc., diabetes, heart, kidney diseases. The rogues gallery continues. And so in order to understand this, you set the stage by looking at the healing cycle itself. And the healing cycle, as Naviaux looks at it, is a dynamic circle, which goes from injury right around through a series of steps back to recovery. And he looks at 4 discrete phases, which we'll go over in a few minutes. And you transition from one of these phases to the next. And it's controlled by various types of metabolic signals. And it is regulated by various checkpoints. You get to a certain healing checkpoint and something kicks in, which we're going to go over. And underlying all of this, as Reid mentioned, is mitochondrial dysfunction. You reduce the normal oxidative phosphorylation, which is what keeps our mitochondria going. It gets altered, and that's what starts the problem. And in fact, this is one of the fundamental features of aging. When we age, one of the reasons we are running into trouble is because the mitochondria are not working as they normally were. They're not as efficient as they were. Now, what does that mean? That we'll go over in a few minutes. And so Naviaux posits the idea of what he calls the cell damage response, and or CDR. So I'm going to use the word CDR for cell damage response. And CDR is a natural, universal cellular reaction to any injury or stress. So we normally go through this. We injure ourselves, we go through a series of steps which will lead through a healing cycle, each with a very specific metabolic feature. And what's the purpose of CDR? Well, it's clear. It helps protect the cell. It jumpstarts the healing process. And it does it in many ways. It changes the membranes. It hardens them. the cell ceases to interact with adjacent cells until the danger is past, because it has to take care of itself. It enters into almost like a little cocoon to heal itself, and it stops interacting as it normally would with other cells, or it gets stuck. And at the molecular level, this cellular equilibrium is altered. So it prevents the completion of the healing cycle, and what's called the first stage of the damage response. And what that means is that it enters S, exceeds the capacity of restorative sleep to repair damage. And the mitochondria change. That's the key thing to understand, is the mitochondria change from what's known as the classic anti-inflammatory type of mitochondria. It's called M2, for those who want to know. You enter into a whole different type of mitochondria. It changes. It now doesn't depend on oxygen, and oxidative studied cell metabolism, no, is not the best way to approach things. But in this case, the cell says, I've got to cocoon. I don't want to use as much oxygen, able to heal. And so it is a protective mechanism to really start to clean out the damage, to pull out the dead cells, to do everything that is needed. Now, that's what normally happens. And you hope that you're going to be able to get past that to enter into what's called CDR2, which is the second stage of this cycling. And this is when all of those cells that were dead need to be replaced, and they're replaced by stem cells. And when the stem cells take over, the mitochondria change again. They change into a form which is called an M0 mitochondria, which now depends on another type of energy function, which is known as an aerobic glycolysis. And glycolysis, the cell is mightily trying to get back to normal. And if it enters into CDR3, which is that third stage, what does that mean? Well, in that stage, what it's saying is, okay, I've managed to clean away the dead cells. I've started to produce new cells. Now I want those cells to differentiate. I want them to remodel. I want to create new types of cells that are going to have good innervation and so on. So the cells in CDR3 stop dividing as very early cells do, because they need that for healing. Now they're saying, let me get back to normal function. I want to communicate with other cells again. I want to have those connections. And that will happen when it returns the mitochondria back to its anti-inflammatory phenotype, meaning the new type of mitochondria which we normally utilize. If all of that works well, you now get back to the health cycle. But what happens if it doesn't work? Well, if it doesn't work, you get all of these different diseases, which I've put on this presentation, and we'll be able to send this out to you. This is not a small problem. This really deals with the classic aspects of almost everything that we see today in major chronic illnesses. So what are the key takeaways? Chronic disease is driven by metabolic dysfunction, which is a consequence of the natural healing cycle becoming blocked. And most chronic illnesses are caused by the biological reaction to an injury, not the initial injury. It's what happens after. And if the cells get caught in a repeating loop of incomplete recovery, re-injury, then they're unable to fully heal. They can't recover. So what you want to do is direct your treatments at the underlying processes that are blocking the healing cycle.